mentioned a few moments ago, trying to answer this question of whether or not we will know one another, recognize one another after we leave this life. I think the Bible has a lot to say about that, and it's a study that I've actually done a few different times before, but it's actually one that it's so good when questions like this come up, because it gives me an opportunity to not only know what I'm going to preach Sunday, but also it helps me to go back through some things and restudy them again. And as I was restudying this particular issue, there were some things that I had not recognized or noticed before, or didn't know about before, or escaped my memory before. And hopefully this will be something that will help us. This should be a very encouraging lesson for us, but it's also one that should encourage us to make sure that we are ready for that day. I believe from the outset that we will have our memories. I believe that not only will we have our memories, but we'll have perfect knowledge and understanding as well. I think the Bible points to that very plainly through a lot of passages. That being said, I know that there are some who would disagree. I know that there are some reasons why people have very honest beliefs that we will not have memories or will not recognize others when we go to heaven. But tonight, hopefully, we'll present a balanced case about that and be able to answer some questions when it comes to whether or not we recognize one another. So if you're ready for your 3 words, let me see the notebooks tonight. All right. Memory, recognition, and knowledge. Memory, recognition, and knowledge are the 3 words. As I said a moment ago, I believe that we're going to have our memories. I think memories play a very important role when it comes to understanding that God has promised something and that God has indeed fulfilled that promise. Part of that promise is going to contain both good things and negative things as well. That there's going to be recognition in the afterlife. There's many passages that point to recognition, that people will recognize one another. People have identities and names attached to them, and I believe that points to it. Knowledge as well. I think we're going to have a better understanding and a better knowledge of how things are and how things have worked out when we go to that next life. So those are your 3 words: memory, recognition, and knowledge. When you think about the idea of going to the other realm, one thing I believe the scriptures point out is that this is a transition that takes place. Sometimes we think about it as being a very abrupt, just one stage type of deal, but when you go through the scriptures, there's some things that are pointed out that I think are important. One that we know very plainly, James 2 and verse 26 point this out when he's talking about faith without works, that faith is dead. But he compares it to something that is a very obvious thing, that when the spirit leaves the body, it is the body that dies. The spirit does not, the body dies. And we know that when that separation occurs, the spirit is separated from the body and the body dies. There's other passages, such as in Genesis 25, verses 7 through 9, and I want you to notice the order of events that take place here. In talking about Abraham, it says that this is the sum of the years of Abraham's life in which he lived, 175 years. Then Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people, and his sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him. So notice that at the very beginning of this passage, when it talks about him beginning this transition, as we're calling it right now, that he breathed his last and he died. But then it says that Abraham was gathered to his people, but Isaac and Ishmael buried him. What's significant about that is he was not near his ancestral home. He wasn't near his fathers or others that went before him. This was in a place where he had actually purchased. Even though it says that he died, he was gathered to his people, but his body was what was being buried. And so you have a transition that is actually in stages that takes place. I believe you see this as well when we go to Luke chapter 9, and there's something very significant that happens here in the language that's used. Let's go to Luke chapter 9. And you remember in Matthew's account, there's the account of Jesus' transfiguration on the mountain. But Luke adds a word here that's very significant. Luke chapter 9 is starting at verse 28. In verse 28, Jesus takes Peter, John, and James, and he goes to the mountain to pray. And as he's praying, the appearance of his face was altered, and his robe became white and glistening. Verse 30, 2 men talked with him, who were Moses and Elijah. Remember, Moses has been dead and gone for about 1,400 years. Elijah's been gone for about 700 or 800 years. But they still are called by that name. They're still recognizable, and they're still identifiable. But Moses and Elijah appear to him in glory, and they speak of, and this is what I want you to notice. Some of your versions may have a different word here. New King James uses the word that they spoke of his decease. Some of your versions may have the word departure. Both of those words are good because they're describing what Jesus is actually about to undergo. And as Jesus is being talked to by Moses and Elijah, the thing that they're actually discussing is that Jesus is about to go to Jerusalem and he's going to give up his life. He's going to die. What's significant about that word is in verse 31 is that word when they speak of his decease is the Greek word exodus or exodus. It's a word that means departure, but it means departure out of one land to go into another land, that you're leaving one land for the purpose of moving to another land. And that's significant, and that is only used a couple more times in Scriptures. In Hebrews 11 and verse 22, is by faith, Joseph, when he was dying, he'd made mention of his exodus, his decease, or his departure. But when he made mention of his departure with the children of Israel, he gave instructions concerning his bones. He was not going to be there anymore. He was going to depart. But when the children of Israel were going to leave, he gave instructions concerning what he wanted to happen with his bones. 2 Peter chapter 1, Peter uses this as well. He says, "For this reason I will not be negligent to write to you always of these things, though you know and are established in this present truth. Yes, I think it is right as long as I am in this tent." Notice the language he uses. "As long as I am in this tent to stir you up by reminding you, knowing that shortly I must put off my tent, just as the Lord Jesus showed me. Moreover, I will be careful to ensure that you always have a reminder of these things after my exodus," or after my decease, the same word that's being used. But when Peter is talking about this, he talks about he being someone who is occupying that body. The body is not him. He is what is occupying that body. That body is a tent or a tabernacle, a temporary dwelling place, but he is what is dwelling within that. And he must shortly put that off that he might exodus to somewhere else. But notice that Peter is saying that he will still be alive and he will still be Peter. But he is just going to put off that tent when death occurs. That transition is very important because people still maintain it, from what we've seen so far, it seems, their identity and knowing that they are still alive and they have not died just because their body has. Then there's another term that is used, especially in the Old Testament, this idea of being gathered to our people, being gathered to their fathers. And it's used many times throughout the Old Testament. When you go through a Hebrew lexicon, one said this about this phrase, that it means to be collected or gathered together. It's used of entering into Hades, where the Hebrews regarded their ancestors as being gathered together. This gathering to one's fathers or one's people is distinguished both from death and burial. And as we've seen, there are examples of this used in the Old Testament. One is there with Abraham in Genesis 25. Later it's used of Isaac in chapter 35. Later it's used of Jacob in chapter 49. And there are many other examples as well. But I use these three for one specific reason. And that's because in Matthew 8, verses 11 and 12, Jesus says that there are going to be many people who will come, both from the east and the west, and they will be sitting down at the table with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. This language was used of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob as a way of comforting one another. It's used here by Jesus in Matthew 8 to talk about how it is that people from all these other nations are going to be invited to a feast with their family, basically, with those who they know as being part of the family of God. That Isaac would be able to look forward to the day that he would see his father Abraham again and recognize him at this table. That Jacob would be able to recognize his father and his grandfather and be able to sit at this table and recognize them and to be comforted by the fact that he would be with them once again. We are comforted by the idea that one day we will be invited into this table where we will be able to sit with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. But Jesus also said that there will be some that will be cast out and weeping and gnashing of teeth. When you look at Luke, who gives another version of this, Luke in chapter 13, verse 28 says, "There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth when you," speaking of some of the religious leaders at the time, "when you see Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all the prophets in the kingdom of God, and you yourselves cast out." So here he says, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to recognize this happening. And for some, it will not be comfort. For some, it will be because they are cast out and will not be allowed to take part of this heavenly feast that's being referred to. And so what we need to understand is that not always this term is used in a comforting fashion. But this is what we have to remember. We are going to be gathered to our people, whether our people are the righteous or whether our people are the unrighteous. The term fellowship is a very important term throughout the Scriptures, and it has reference to those that we are tightly bound to and knit together with. And if we are in fellowship with the righteous here on earth, that fellowship is going to continue into that next life. But if we are in fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness and those who practice such things, we will continue to be in fellowship with them into the next life. And again, it is not always a comforting thought. And I want to notice just a few of them. When you think about King Saul with the witch or the sorceress of Endor, that you remember that he is very much upset because God is tearing the kingdom away from him. And David is going to be the one who's going to be the next king. And this troubles him, so he tries to find someone who can give him some insight or maybe give him some something to hold on to. And when he goes to this sorceress and talks to her, she's just as surprised as he is when Samuel appears. And notice Samuel has been dead, but Samuel is recognizable. And he asks him, "Why is it that you've disturbed me? You've already been told the kingdom's been ripped away from you. And you're going to die, you and your son. So why are you disturbing me?" That would be a terrifying thing for a person to hear, no doubt. But when was Saul going to know that this promise was fulfilled? Samuel says that when you see me, then you know that this promise has been fulfilled and that you've lost because God has taken this away from you. In Isaiah chapter 14, I want us to look at this one to read this passage. Isaiah chapter 14. When we go here, there's this person called Lucifer, and Lucifer in the Scriptures is not a term for Satan. When you go back to verse 4 of Luke 14, Isaiah chapter 14 and verse 4, it says that when you take up this proverb against the king of Babylon, this is the one who's referred to as Lucifer or day star, as it's translated. But if you go down to verse 12, notice this. It says, "How you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning. How you are cut down to the ground, you who weaken the nations. For you have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will also sit on the mount of the congregation on the farthest sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. Yet you shall be brought down to Sheol, to the lowest depths of the pit." And notice in verse 16, those who see you, when he goes down to the pit, those who see you will gaze at you. These will be people that possibly knew him in life. Maybe these people have already passed before and never saw him, but they will recognize him when he is there. They will gaze at you and consider you, saying, "Is this the man who made the earth tremble, who shook kingdoms, who made the world as wilderness and destroyed its cities, who did not open the house of his prisoners?" And so when you think about what's being said here is that there's a mockery that's going to be made of the king of Babylon because of the way in which he exalted himself. And that those who are already in that other side awaiting him are going to mock him when they see him. But they're going to be able to recognize him. And they're going to be able to recall the things in which he had exalted himself and knew about. One example that we know very well is in Luke chapter 16 with the rich man and Lazarus. But think of it from that rich man's perspective. That rich man is told to remember that in your life you had good things. And Lazarus, who he also remembers and recognizes, had his evil things. And he tells the man that now you are in torment, but he is being comforted. He recognizes Abraham as Abraham is the one who's telling him this thing. He recognizes where he is at, and there's a great gulf that's fixed that his attention is drawn to, so he cannot pass from one side to another. He remembers that he has 4 brothers who are back in this world, and he doesn't want them to come to this place. By the way, if you have family members who have left this life and they were not saved, they don't want you going to that place either. And that's important for the end of this lesson tonight when it comes to what about those who are lost that we love so much. They don't want you going there either. But he also recognizes that Lazarus, that is there, that Lazarus would be able to tell them something. And Abraham says, no, they have Moses and the prophets. If they won't listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not listen even if somebody comes back from the dead. But in that account, you see that the rich man still had his memory and he still had his identity. Matthew 25 is another judgment scene. And in Matthew 25, Jesus is going to sit there and divide the people as a shepherd divides the sheep from the goats. And those who are the goats, the ones who are divided off to the left side, that these are the ones that when they saw those people in need, did not care. They didn't give to those who were in need. They didn't provide water for the thirsty, or food for the hungry, or clothes for those without it, or to visit the sick and those who were imprisoned. And Jesus says, inasmuch as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And you remember what they said. When did we see you? And Jesus points out to them that they could remember the times where they did not provide for those who were in need. Those uncaring will have those memories throughout all eternity. But on the other hand, and this is the comfort for us, the Bible describes for Christians, though, that this is a joyful reunion in places like 2 Samuel. And this should be comfort for many, because there are some who have lost children. And David was one that had committed a sin with Bathsheba. And because of that sin that he had committed with her, God had pronounced judgment that this child was going to die. And you remember that David, when this child was sick, that David fasted and he prayed that this child would not be taken from him. And the people in the castle knew just how diligent he was about his fasting and his prayer. And then when the child died, they were afraid to tell David, because surely he would take his own life now because of the sorrow that he had. But you remember David's response? That he got up, he washed his face, and he took food, and people were surprised at that. And he makes this statement that I shall go to him, but he shall not return to me. And that should be a comforting statement for us. I shall go to him, but he will not come to me. To be able to be reunited with that child. The question is often asked, well, what form will they be in? I don't know for sure. The Bible, I don't think, tells us explicitly about that. But it does tell us such things as that we shall be like him, that he will transform this lowly body to be conformed to his glorious body. So whatever form that is, I believe that they're going to have just as much knowledge and understanding and memory as the rest of us will. But to be able to be reunited with that child should be a comforting thing for us. In Job, and this is one that I found very interesting. Let's go to Job chapter 1. Well, first, Job 42. You can place a marker there in Job 1, but go to Job 42 first. At the end of Job's life, after he had repented and God accepted that and was going to restore to him, Job 42 and verse 10, it says, that the Lord restored Job's losses when he prayed for his friends. And notice that indeed the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Now, if you look back at Job chapter 1, and you notice the things that Job had in verses 2 and 3, I'm going to read it from chapter 42 and see if all these things doubled. Job 42 and verse 12 is where I'm going to read. You look at it, Job 1. Now the Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning, for he had 14,000 sheep. Job 1, he had 7,000, right? 6,000 camels, so he had 3,000 at the beginning. 1,000 yoke of oxen, so he had 500 at the beginning. And 1,000 female donkeys, so he had 500 at the beginning. He also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. Is that double? So how is it that Job would have had everything doubled? Those 7 sons and 3 daughters were lost at the beginning to this life. But Job had not lost them. Those 7 sons and 3 daughters were still alive. And Job could be reunited with them. And here at the end of the book of Job, he has 7 more sons and 3 more daughters. And so it is doubled. But he has some in the next life and some in this. Those possessions don't go. That's what I believe is happening there, though I cannot put a hard stamp on it. But to me, that is something that is an amazing thing to consider. Because for us as Christians, Christians never really say goodbye. That we lose someone to that next life, we're going to see them again. There's going to be a reunion. We haven't lost them. It's only for a time that we're separated. And it's a beautiful thought to consider in Luke 23 and verse 43. With the thief on the cross. That while they're there, there's two thieves that are there, and they're both chastising Jesus at the beginning, but one changes his mind and says, you know what, this is not right. This man is innocent. We're getting the thing that we deserve. And he asks Jesus to remember him when he comes into his kingdom. And Jesus tells him, today you will be with me in paradise. What an amazing thought to think that within a few short hours, that thief was going to have his body hanging on that tree and be taken down from that tree, but that thief is nowhere near that body, because he's in paradise with the Lord. And to think that when he arrives in paradise, that Jesus is actually there to greet him. And he can remember what Jesus had just said to him not long before, that today, this day, you will be with me in paradise. Jesus was buried in one grave. This thief's body was probably disposed of like a common criminal. And yet, neither one of them were with those bodies. They were together in paradise and being comforted. That is a beautiful reunion that's supposed to take place. As we read from 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, 19 and 20, Paul said this about his brethren: for what is our hope or joy or crown of rejoicing? Is it not even you in the presence of our Lord Jesus Christ at his coming? For you are our glory and our joy. It was comforting for Paul to be able to say and to know that he would be with his brethren, because the deep bonds of love that he had for them was going to continue long after that life was over with. And you think about what it was that motivated Paul throughout his preaching. And as he was preaching to these people, he talked about caring for them, especially with the Thessalonian brethren, that he cared for them as a mother does with their nursing child. He had that kind of deep affection and connection with them. And Paul is pointing to the fact that this connection's not going to be lost. This is what I want. I want to be able to go into the next life and just wait for that time where I get to see you again. Because again, Christians never really say goodbye. It's only for a short period of time that we have to go through. 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 through 18, we studied this scripture not too long ago. But notice what it says again in just parts of this passage. That it talks about God bringing with him those who sleep in Jesus. And we who are alive and remain being caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. Caught up together with them to be with the Lord forever. With them. There are brethren that I know that you've never met. You've never heard their name before. It's going to be awesome when you get to meet them and be in that heavenly abode. That's going to be an awesome day. When you imagine those that we have all known, and they being in paradise, being in that realm where they're being comforted, and being able to see all those other saints that have gone on long before us and being comforted. That's something that motivates us and moves us toward that day. Philemon, verse 15, is another one that I think is really important. You remember that Paul is talking to Philemon about this servant, Onesimus, that had left. And Paul meets him while he's on the run. And he converts Onesimus, this slave, and sends him back to his master. But when he sends him back to his master, he says this: for perhaps he departed for a while for this purpose, that you might receive him back forever. Not talking about this life, because now he's talking about you receiving him back, not as a slave, but as a brother. Not as a servant, but much more than a servant, as your brother. And when you receive him back, you're never going to lose him again, because now he's your brother, and you'll be together forever. I love this passage in Revelation 21, that the last part of the verse where John says there was no more sea. Because the sea has the idea of things that separate. John being exiled to the Isle of Patmos and being separated by the oceans, by the seas, from other people that he knew and other brethren that he loved. And there being no more sea, no more separation, nothing that keeps us apart from one another ever again, ought to be comforting to us, to know that we'll never have that again. In closing, there's a couple of objections that I do want to answer. And that is the idea of the lost loved ones and the end of marriage. Whenever I tried to do a lot of research this past week on what are the objections, what are the passages that are used as an objection to the idea of us not recognizing one another in heaven. These were the two main ones, and the ones that people gave the most credence to. when I read their reasoning behind it, it was not a host of scriptures that they gave to justify that position. Instead, it was all based upon the emotional toll that it would take for a person to be separated. Imagine having a husband or a wife or a son or daughter or parents that are lost, and then you're supposed to be able to enjoy heaven without them being there. Angie and I have went on trips before without our children. We never during that trip said, boy, we wish the kids were here. Now, I know that that's a silly analogy, but there is an ability to enjoy things separated from one another. Now, that is a strictly fleshly and temporal type of thing. But we know that Revelation 21 and verse 4 tells us that God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There's a reason for the tears, and God is going to be able to wipe them away. He says there's going to be no more death, no sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away. And so there are people who say that if I go to heaven knowing that one of my loved ones is not there, I'm not going to be able to enjoy being in heaven. Likewise, people will point to Matthew 22 and verse 30, where Jesus is confronted with this question about the resurrection. And it's from the Sadducees, who, by the way, did not even believe in the resurrection. But they're asking Jesus about this woman who's really hard on a man. She has 7 husbands, and they all end up dying. And then she alone is left and dies. And they ask the question, well, who will she belong to? Whose wife will she be in the resurrection? And Jesus points out that you don't even understand this, because in the resurrection, they're not given or taken in marriage, but are like the angels of God in heaven. So people are asking the question, so how is it that heaven can be this place where I can dwell for all eternity with my spouse and us not be married to one another? I wouldn't be able to take that. So you mean that I have to live in my mansion and my wife can't live in that mansion with me anymore? And things such as that. But you see, it's based all upon an emotional attachment. And they say, so God must be, when he's wiping away the tears, he must be wiping away the memories of individuals. But there's also a part of that passage that says, but they will be like the angels. For my studies, the angels had names. At least some of them did. And they were able to recognize one another, it seems. So why would we not be able to recognize our loved ones? The point is this: if you go back just one verse in Matthew 22 and verse 29, Jesus answered by saying this, you are mistaken, not knowing the Scriptures nor the power of God. If there was one place in Scripture where God would be able to point out to us, where Jesus would have been able to state very plainly, whose wife will she be in the resurrection? His answer could have been, you don't know what you're talking about. You're not even going to remember one another in the resurrection. But he didn't say that. Instead, he said, you don't know the Scriptures nor the power of God. I don't know how powerful God really is. But I do believe his promises. I doubt the power of God when I say I cannot enjoy heaven if my loved one is not there. I doubt the power of God by saying that. That I would not be able to enjoy heaven if I'm not still married to my spouse. I doubt the power of God when I say such things as that. I don't know how powerful God is. That would be something that would just be beyond my comprehension. And there are good, honest people who have objections to what I presented tonight because of those ideas. But I believe that Jesus' answer is correct for those objections. You're mistaken, not knowing the Scriptures nor the power of God. God will wipe away every tear from our eyes. Whether it be those in Revelation 6 who are beneath the throne of God and know that they were tortured and put to death for faith in God, and they cry out, how much longer before we are avenged? They had memories of what had happened and who had done it. And God is able to wipe away those tears as well. Our God is a God who keeps his promises, no matter how remarkable they may seem to us. Jesus used this occasion to point out exactly what needed to be heard. I think for some of us, the main thing for us may be that we're only looking forward to heaven because we will get to see our loved ones again. I would submit that that's not enough and that's not good enough. Would you be able to, and can you imagine yourself enjoying heaven if none of them were there? And that the only person that you would see is God himself. Would that be enough? Revelation 22 talks about they shall see his face. Is that enough? And maybe that would help us in being motivated. Maybe that would help us in being more purposeful and having our priorities straight if that's why I want to go to heaven. If I don't make it to heaven, I want my kids to go. I want my family to go. I want my friends to go. I don't want to be lost. And I don't want anyone else to be lost either. But why in the world would you ever give up heaven because someone else decided that they would give up heaven? Why would you do that? Why? We can't base what we do strictly on emotions and the ties that we rely upon here on this earth because we know how fragile they are and how temporal they are. But the things of heaven are eternal, and those are the things that we need to hold on to. So I hope this has been instructive for you. If there's some other things that I need to consider, if you have some other objections that I didn't address tonight, please let me know, because as I said, I tried to find some other objections, and really I could not find anything other than just these two. Christians never really say goodbye. This may be the last night that we see each other in this earth. That scare you or make you happy? Can we be like the thief on the cross, that when Jesus said, "Today you will be with me in paradise," to think, yeah, maybe today will be the day that we're able to be together in paradise. The question I'm going to leave with you is, are you looking forward to that great reunion day? Because you are going to be gathered to your people one day. Whether they are the righteous or the unrighteous, you're going to be gathered to your people. Let tonight be the night you make that decision that if I'm going to be gathered to my people, it's going to be at the table with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and as Luke even included, all the prophets of old. To be ready for that day, to know that as we're going to sing in just a moment, that when this roll is called up yonder, when the names are read, that your name is written in that book of life. Let tonight be the night that you fix whatever needs to be fixed, and we would love to help you in any way. So together we stand and sing. Please come if we can help.